Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this training session. It is such an honor to be your host. It is such an honor to just welcome you to this. And as Brad said to Natalie and myself, if his screen sharing is working, then you should be hungry right about now, because that picture of perfectly sliced biltong, goodness me, wow, so good. But yeah, welcome. My name's Jonathan Haller. It gives me great privilege to serve on the Association of Christian Media Board and to be your MC for this morning's online training. If I cut my mic every now and then, it's because I've got a bit of the flu. So I might just have to just switch it off if I need a cough or something like that. But so great. Yes, as you can see on the screen, the art of Biltong making, 10 ways to tell stories that stick. And just a little bit about Brad. Well, before I get into the little bit about Brad, we've got an hour's training from Brad. And then after that, there'll be a great time for questions and answers. What I find always helpful is while Brad's presentation is ongoing, feel free to use the comments section to just pop your question there so that you don't forget, because, you know, there's a lot of information that's going to be coming our way. And feel free to pop your question at any stage during Brad's presentation. And then at the end, we'll get to that. And we'll be done by 11:30. So it's going to be really fantastic with regard to that. This morning, I was thinking really hard. And I was thinking, when was the first time I met Brad Kirsten? Have you ever met Brad Kirsten? Well, I had the privilege of meeting him. I think the year was 1997. It makes me sound older than I feel, but nonetheless, Brad is now has always been and is an amazing guy. I got to work alongside him in 2007 till about 2011. And just an amazing guy. You're going to enjoy his presentation. You're going to enjoy him as an individual. And I can just tell you from a personal point of view, I wouldn't have anybody else doing this training other than Brad, because he's really so good at communicating and good at what he does. I love the way his bio puts it. And I mean, this is really to the point. Brad loves living his dream, spending most of his life wearing headphones and speaking into a microphone. Of course, he's a radio presenter, a media trainer, a voiceover artist, and an event MC. And Brad has a passion for mentoring and helping aspiring communicators with the desire to help them to make the best moments their starting point. And then, of course, the sky is the limit for those people. He's a husband, he's a dad, and will look for any excuse to watch a good game of rugby on the telly. So without further ado, let's just say welcome, Brad. And before we go into the presentation, just to say, we've had some technical issues. So Brad's not going to put his camera on, but you're welcome to keep your cameras on and obviously just keep your mics muted. Brad, over to you, bud.
Thanks, Jonathan. Trust everybody can hear me well. Apologies, you know how it goes. Your camera works for any other presentation or anything else you need to do in the moment. You need to step up and be the person who runs the show like I've been given the privilege of doing today. It doesn't work. So thanks for bearing with me. As long as you can see my screen, you're good. Hi to everybody, those I know and I don't know, those I've met in person and know well. It's fantastic to be able to sit here and bring you the art of biltong making. 10 ways to tell stories that stick. And if you're looking at that screen, like Jonathan said, and you're feeling just a little bit peckish, things are working well, and then everything's going to be running smoothly, I trust. As I move along through this, I just want to echo what Jonathan said, make some notes. There's a lot of information for an hour, and I'm going to do my very best to keep it into the hour mark. So keep those notes and of questions you want to ask, and I'll do my very best to answer them. Now, for anyone who's ever joined me before would have heard me say this, I'm going to say it again to you today. I'm the guide on the side. I'm not the guy that pretends to know everything. I don't pretend to have all the answers, but I'm going to be walking alongside you as content creators, as broadcasters, as radio people, TV people, online people. And I'm going to say this. Telling a good story is absolutely vital, because if you bring people to facts and figures and data and statistics, those things have their place. Those aren't the kind of things that are going to get people hanging on your every word. Those aren't the kind of things that get people massively interested in what it is that you're going to say. Those things are important. Often they're those long PowerPoint presentations that make you yawn and you get a little bit bored and you just lose interest, don't even remember. Telling things in a story form knocks the spit out of facts and figures. If you can learn to tell a good story and you can use it to convey whatever it is that you want to do, it doesn't matter where you are, even if you want to speak to your kids, discipline your children even, storytelling works exceptionally well. It helps to set the scene. It helps to give us a little connecting point. Often the stories shared in different cultures allow us to feel connected to something, to belong. Sometimes, like we're doing today with food, and as South Africans, Biltong is one of those things that draws us together, which is why I chose this. Now, when I was 16 years old, my dad said, let's go hunting. Now, I'm a city slicker. I always have been. Now, this idea of going hunting in the Free State was something that seemed very unusual to me, but also weirdly exciting. So we piled in the car with two other mates of my dad's, and we drove through to this farm in the middle of the Free State. And there I met some of the most down-to-earth, interesting, and based on how much they were packing heat, a bunch of dangerous individuals with all the guns that were around. My dad freaking out, wondering, are we all going to be safe? Is this going to be a weekend that's going to be good or bad? He didn't know, and I didn't know either. I'm around all these people that are doing things that I had no idea about, but if you can't beat them, join them. So they had a .22 out and giving us opportunities to shoot at things, and I was probably the oldest with the .22. All the rest were kids, and I realized I was way out of my depth here, but I was there because I wanted to shoot an animal. Now, if that upsets you, I'm sorry, but that was a hunting weekend, and we're good South African men and women here. So let me get into this story. Opportunity came to head out on the bucky early one morning with this massive rifle. I don't even know what you call it, but it was big. And I had it resting on the top of the bucky, and I saw a springbok in the distance. And I eventually fired that shot. The buck dropped, and as we headed on this bucky down this road in between trees, it wasn't even a real road. We were just flying over ant hills and over things and holes in the ground. I was holding on for dear life, but this guy in this bucky was caning it to where this animal had fallen. And when we got there, I saw, oh my goodness, I had actually shot and killed the springbok. So they said, now you got to pick it up and get it into the bucky. Now I'm grabbing the thing by the horns. It's heavy. I don't know what I'm doing. One of the guys that are helping there helps me. We get this thing onto the back of the bucky. And I'm sitting there as we drive along for I don't know how long, and I'm staring at this animal that's just lying here, this massive thing just lying here in the back of the bucky with me. And something inside of me clicked. Now, I don't know what you want to call it. If you want to call it like Lord of the Flies moment, I don't know what you want to call it. But there I was with this animal on the back, and suddenly I felt like I knew what I needed to do, like something primal had awakened inside of me as a man. And I remember us driving along, a couple of other guys also shot some animals. We put them on the back of the bucky, and we headed in through to where we were camping. And there the guys were starting to hang up these animals. And they were going to start skinning them and cutting them, whatever. And I said, can I try? And they showed me what to do. And I got in there and I started to skin this animal myself. And I don't know what happened inside of me. I went from city slicker to, I don't know what, Indiana Jones, call me what you want, Crocodile Dundee, or just Koos van der Merwe. And I was busy getting the skin off this springbok. I skinned the entire thing. They showed me how to get the horns off and how to stick it into coarse salt and how you can preserve this thing. And I ended up taking these horns home, and then they helped us cut up this thing. And then the next day, when we were back at home, the biltong making started. And I know we managed, out of just the one part of the springbok that we used for biltong, we got 200 pieces of biltong. I know that because we used paper clips to hang them up to dry. And we bought 2 packets of 100 paper clips. That's 200 pieces of springbok biltong hanging in our garage. And my life was never the same again. Now, I had to start with a story because this is about telling stories. Now, maybe you've done what I did. Maybe you've always wanted to do what I did. Maybe you're too scared because you don't know how you will react. And something inside of me clicked, and I made it happen despite me ever thinking that I would ever achieve anything like that. But stories remain connecting points. Stories take us on a journey. Stories open up our minds to possibilities and to things. And when it comes to, as I'm trying to move my slides along here this morning, we hope that we can put together something like this. Now, when you look at this, a number of things are going to happen. You're either going to feel incredibly hungry, or maybe you're going to have a completely different feeling. Maybe when you look at that picture, it makes you pull a face. Oh, gross. Oh, I don't like that. Maybe there's a story there. Did you have a bad experience? Did you eat a piece of dodgy biltong? Did you not like it? Do you not like the idea of eating meat? I don't know, but did it make you pull a face? Have you almost imagining that you could smell that? You can almost smell the coriander. You can smell the meat. It makes you think of something. Now, immediately it's taking you on a trip. Maybe it's watching rugby, if that's the kind of thing you like. Maybe it's a road trip you were on. Maybe it was just sitting and munching on a piece while having a conversation with somebody you care about. The picture of that biltong might have set off a craving. It might have reminded you, as I've said, about a special occasion with someone. And that in itself is another story to tell. Maybe it wish you hadn't skipped breakfast. Because now you're really hungry and there's not much you can do about it. Unless you do make your own biltong, you're going to have to wait till you can get to the shop. Maybe you're plant-based and you're thinking, man, is there a loophole? Is there any way I can maybe just get a piece of that biltong and make it fit into my lifestyle? I've got 10 ways today that are going to help you tell stories that stick. Stories that help you to remember information. Short stories that help you to connect with people on a personal level, on an emotional level. Stories are very powerful. When I spend time with corporates, I share with them the power of storytelling in telling your brand story. Where did you start? What difficulty did you have to overcome? What is the reason that you started the business? Did you leave corporate and then decide one day you were going to start your own business? Why? Did it have to do with you wanting to spend more time at home with your children? That's a connecting point. You share that as a brand. You share that even on another place where you broadcast. You're immediately latching on to all the moms out there that are wishing that they also could do something like you've done. To say, I'm turning my back on corporate because I want to live life on my own terms. Maybe a side hustle is developed into something that became something that's full-time. And you tell that story to somebody in whichever forum you want to, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. You start sharing that on the right forums. You start to have people saying, just like when we share our testimony about Jesus, that's a connecting point. If God could do it for them, he can do it for me. If you could do that and that was the outcome, maybe I can do that too. It becomes a connection point. There might be brands that you purchase from, food and toiletries and makeup and other things that you might buy, stuff you buy for your garage, tools based purely on the fact that there's a story there. I don't know how it works, but it grabs something deep down inside. I've listened to somebody tell a story before that I sat crying listening to the story. And I'm saying, why am I crying about a story that one guy is telling about his best friend and their motorbike? How is it that I'm so emotionally connected to the story? If they hadn't shared the story, would I ever remembered what it was all about? Now, whether you care about biltong or not, whether you like making biltong or not, there's just a handful of little things you have to remember. And I'm going to grab these things and I'm going to connect them to some tips that are going to help us to tell better stories. When you are going to make biltong, you need to choose the correct kind of meat. I'm not going to get into the technicalities. You can't just use any kind of meat. You have to use a particular kind, like a silver side or whatever, or sirloin cut or something. You can probably make biltong out of any cut, but it won't necessarily be that tasty or that tender. But you need to choose the correct kind of meat. You need to cut with the grain. You cannot cut across the grain. Meat has a natural grain. You cut it along there, it becomes more succulent. The pieces are longer and also dries better. You have to use malt vinegars and spices for the preserving process. And then once you've done that correctly, you need to hang it up to dry. And that takes time, which means you have to wait patiently for it to take place. This isn't a rushed thing. If you like it fairly wet, like I do, you only have to wait 3 or 4 days, and that's not necessarily a long time, but it still requires patience. And then you get fun choices. Do I chop it up like it looks like on the screen, or am I going to grab a big piece in my hand and just tear it with my teeth like a good old Neanderthal? And then, of course, you wonder when you've got biltong, particularly a lot of it, where did all these friends come from? Now everybody wants some. And then you get to eat it. And of course, that's the best part of all. So let's get into these things. Why is storytelling so important? Well, I mentioned that it just beats the spittle out of facts and figures. Facts and figures can be boring. Stories draw us in. Stories can be immensely powerful and impactful. Stories that are successful have to be relatable. Otherwise, they just pass over our heads. The moment there's something in a story that draws me in, I'm in. because I relate. And I will be covering this in more detail because it's one of the most fundamentals of good stories is to make things relatable. Telling stories is something you can learn. I learned from my mother, who learned from her uncle. And I'll tell you more about that as well in a moment, because that's incredibly important when it comes down to the fact that it's a skill that can be learned. Stories bring information together and they create connecting points. Because if you remember the story, you remember the points. Quickly, before I move on, I'm not one for screens like you're busy seeing right now where things pop up and everybody can read. I'm a visual kind of guy, so you're going to get a lot of visuals and not a lot of writing. So if there are things that I'm saying, you're not going to see them on your screen. You're going to have to write them down. So make sure you keep good notes, and we'll connect again when I'm done if there's anything that comes to mind that you want to chat about. So let's get into it. When it comes to storytelling and anything, we need to know our vision. Biblically, we know when there's no vision, the people perish. So when it comes to telling stories, we need to have a vision. Just like with Biltong, we can say, I like Biltong, I'm hungry, so therefore I'm going to buy Biltong. I make Biltong maybe because it's a hobby, or it's a gift from somebody, or I might want to start making my own Biltong as a side hustle. There's always a vision. There's a reason why we do things. When it comes to storytelling, we need to make a choice. And we need to say things like, I want to tell good stories because I want to add value to my radio program. I want to add value to my broadcast, to my online space, to my business, whichever space you're in. Why? I could say, well, I want to make a point. I want to highlight a value. I want to do better presentations. Once you know what your vision is, the details start to fall in place. But without a plan, you can't start anywhere. So we're going to begin with this one. Quite straightforward, quite uncomplicated, but it's going to require a lot of your time. Why do I want to tell stories? And where do I want to tell my stories? So we need to start developing a vision of what stories we want to tell, why we want to tell them, and where we're going to use them. We need to know who it is that we're speaking to. When it comes to Biltong, it's Druivors or Biltong. Is it going to be beef, or am I going to make springbok? Or do I want to eat kudu, or do I want to eat ostrich? Well, it depends what you like. We're each different. You know what you like, you know what you don't like. So when it comes to telling a story, you have to know your audience, because you need to ask yourself, is what I want to say applicable? Is it going to hit home? Is this a faith-based audience? That will determine the kind of stories I tell. Am I in business? Is this happening on media? Is this happening in church? Is this a connecting point with people from the secular world? Does this have to be a serious story? Because funny stories don't always have their place, although they're always a good place to start. So can I tell a funny story? Do I need to tell a complex story? Well, when it comes to storytelling, we want to try and avoid things being too complex, because otherwise you lose the audience. And that's the worst thing to do, because storytelling is supposed to be a connecting point. Do we have a kids audience? That means we have to try and keep the story really straightforward and simple. When it comes to telling stories and choosing the right place to tell it, is where we're going to start doing our preparation. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit, and I'm going to say we need to start collecting stories, and we need to start deciding all of these stories that we're collecting, where can they best be used? Is this something that I can tell kids and I can also use in a business presentation? Because there are many stories like that. And particularly those funny stories, you've got to nail the punchline, because if you don't nail the punchline, it's going to be a crash and burn when you tell your story. So you need to land it, and I'll talk more about that in great detail very, very shortly. The other big question you have to ask yourself is, which medium am I going to use the story? Because look at this. If I don't say a word and you just look at this picture, man, there's a lot going on. Look at the color of the sky. Look at the ground in front of the ark. Catch that light that's on in the entrance to the ark. I don't see any animals, so that already sets the idea of where we are in the process here of getting ready for the rain to come. I don't see any water anywhere, do you? Now, I don't need to say much more than that if you're looking at this picture without it being a radio opportunity. So what do I have to do if I'm looking at this picture and I have to somehow try and convince the radio listeners of what they're seeing? There's some hard work ahead. So when it comes to the kind of story you're going to tell, you need to make sure you know which medium it's in. I'm going to let that just hang there for a little bit. It's incredibly striking. There's so many elements. There's so much drama. But you're going to need a lot of time to be able to convey rather said, that information to a radio audience. So decide which medium you're going to use. Visually, that changes the game. Audio, that changes the game. I'm going to let that picture just hang there for a moment, and I'm going to see what that unlocks. The third thing that we have to remember if we want to tell great stories that stick is stories have to be relatable. We need to put people into the story. Now, we can start all kinds of weird stories looking at this. If you stare at toilet paper, it makes some people feel very uncomfortable because it's a very private and personal thing. I get it. I'm mentioning it now out loud, so it's already out there. Then you got people that are saying, no, 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 toilet paper needs to hang in the back, not the front. This picture is wrong. Toilet paper sits at the back of the roll and you pull from the back, not from the front. You see, although toilet paper, it kind of becomes this weird thing to talk about. Can you remember COVID? I don't know what we were thinking. And if you look at some American footage, it was all about stockpiling toilet paper. This is a relatable thing. We all have it in our homes. There's the 1-ply, 2-ply conversation. Okay. Toilet paper is relatable. When you're the first person to use the roll, trying to get that glue loose is either going to get it undone perfectly or is going to get you grabbing one corner and you're going to sit with 1 meter long of 2 centimeter wide toilet paper. And that's good for nobody. You notice how I don't even need to explain anything much more to you because we all use the stuff. So what we need to do whenever we tell a story, now please don't have to spend your whole life talking about toilet paper, but it's relatable. Suddenly, what happens if you're the last person to use it? What happens if you go in and there is none? What do you go in your own home and all you see is a little brown carton thing hanging onto the chrome fitting for dear life? You walk in there, reach out, and there's nothing. And there's none in the little basket or next to you or however else you do things when it comes to storing toilet paper. A crazy example, but I think there were 7 conversations that we brought out, maybe 8, just from a roll of toilet paper. That's what makes memes so powerful, is how relatable they are. I saw one the other day. There was this Dachshund, and he looked like he was being a DJ, and he had the decks there in front of him, and he was bopping to the tune of an iPhone alarm. And then at the bottom, the comment in the meme was, this is me at 6:30 in the morning, dreaming that somehow I'm involved with my alarm. Meanwhile, my alarm's trying to wake me up. Something like that. I don't think I nailed the punchline, which is bad coming from me. But it's relatable. I've also dreamt about my alarm going off and it was incorporated into a piece of music that I was listening to in my dream. Meanwhile, it's my alarm trying to get me up. Bringing it back to Biltong. That's what makes Biltong so relatable. Almost every shop in South Africa that sells food sells Biltong. We make it. We buy it. Making Biltong is incredibly rewarding, as weird as it is. There are things like boerewors, rugby, load shedding, state capture. These are connecting points we all have as South Africans. And these are the kind of things that we need to think about when we tell stories. What do we have in common? I'd like to imagine all of us, since this is the ACM, we're all believers in Jesus. We're church goers. We are media creators. We are content creators. We have a lot in common. When you tell stories, make sure that what you tell is relatable. Good. I can't interact with all of you. This is really weird for me. I love being in front of everybody and connecting, and I love to see your faces, and I love to wave my arms around. You can't see me and I can't see you. But let's move on. I had a whole presentation you might remember from 2 years ago at the ACM conference. Stop being boring. And I think this is so vitally important for us, particularly in a time where we are bombarded with content coming in from everywhere. I don't know if you've ever seen what's going on around you and you think, I can't be an actual content creator that brings new ideas to the fore. It feels like everything has already been tried and tested and out there. What could I possibly create? What could I possibly do that's new? And sometimes we feel like there's nowhere for us to go. Am I just going to be reusing old stuff? Am I just going to be sounding the same as everybody else? It's very possible to get lost in the noise, and it's very possible to be boring. We've got such a short attention span. Things happen so quickly, and we want to try and compete with that, even in the Christian market, in the faith-based content creation market. It feels like a cutthroat business out there. How do we stay relevant? Well, we can't be boring, and to not be boring requires us to be stretched, which means we need to put effort in when we create our stories, which I'm trusting is going to be the brunt of our content. To tell good stories is going to require effort from us, or otherwise people are just going to be lost. We need to start thinking in stories. My wife does this in the area of Instagram stories. She creates stories regularly, and that's how she does what she does for her business. That's kind of the cornerstone of reaching women. That's her core focus area in the business that she runs. She thinks you've got to start thinking in stories. Now, you might not be one for doing Instagram stories or Facebook stories, but we need to start thinking in stories. You see, with Biltong, you can make it completely unboring. You can mix the spices. You can add chili, or you can take chili out. You can add a little bit more salt or a bit more coriander. You can work on that black pepper coriander ratio. But you don't want to mess it up, because if you add too much vinegar in the very beginning, you've got a vinegary product, which means you have to put thought and care into the creation of the Biltong. And exactly the same when you're creating stories. Do research. Keep notes, and I'll talk a lot about note keeping in a moment, because it's vitally important in the area of storytelling and creating metaphors on which to build your stories. Do your research. Keep notes. You need to plan well, and you need to write these things down. Trust me, you get an idea. How many times has this happened to you? You've got an idea of something you want to do in your program or in something you want to create with your content. You're driving along, you're thinking about it. By the time you get to where you're going, it's out of your mind, no matter how hard you try to remember it, because you didn't write it down. What do you see around you? Write the things down. Keep a file. Keep a story file. Be intentional. Aim to make the things you create relevant. Make it interesting. Make it colorful, and plan. And the way you do that will ensure that the content you create will not be boring. It means the stuff you create will be well thought out. Intentionality is a word I use a lot. Nothing is just going to happen by osmosis. You're not just going to wake up one day and be the world's best storyteller. You might be good at it, but don't you want to be really good at it? So we need to make a point of being intentionally excellent. It's something I bring up regularly when I speak. We need to be intentionally excellent. And I think that's something worth writing down. It's a good value for life. It's a good value for the work that we do, that God's called us to do. We have to do things with excellence, but intentional excellence. And for us, being intentionally excellent and really being people who care about the content that we create when it comes down to the stories that we tell, we have to work hard at it and be intentionally excellent. Moving swiftly along, we don't have heaps of time. We've got lots to get through. We have to be authentic. This comes down to our integrity. This comes down to telling truth. This comes down to trustworthiness, that our yes is going to be our yes and our no is going to be our no. But Brad, even in the context of storytelling, well, it's like buying Biltong and then telling everybody you made it. Wow, you make really good Biltong. But you didn't make it because you bought it and flogged it off as your own. Bizarre? When it comes to storytelling, people want to hear authentic stories. I've heard it mentioned, and that's why I'm bringing it up, because I can't believe it actually exists. There are brands that tell made-up stories. They're not convinced that the story that they have to tell about their brand, where it originated from, and hopefully to be able to draw people in to make a heart connection, they don't feel they're able to make a heart connection. So they have fake brand stories. Now, I don't know which brands have got fake brand stories, but there are enough articles out around fake brand storytelling to know that it happens. People want so desperately to connect with other people in a legitimate, authentic way that they're prepared to bend the truth in order for somebody else to like what they sell. Now, we might not be in the corporate space trying to sell something. Maybe you are listening right now. But if there's a point you want to make and you don't have a story about it, then don't tell a story about it. Skip it. Or if you have a story, what is needed, then tell the story. If you know somebody else's story, and this happens a lot because I hear a lot of great stories, and so do you as well. Use other people's stories, but just credit it and don't try and fluff it up and try and make it look like it was your story and put yourself in its place. When you tell stories, people want to hear authentic stories. The story in the beginning I told about hunting. I'm not proud of the fact that I was the city slicker that had no idea what was going on and was hoping I didn't hurt myself or worse. It actually turned out to be a really incredible experience. I told it. I might not have been the hero of the story, although I'd like to think I was. I have a picture of me holding up that springbok, and I treasure it to this day. I know what I've got inside of me because I was put to the test, that I was stretched. So don't tell fake backstories. People need to feel connected. They need to be touched by what it is that you share, and they need to be inspired. People do not want to be lied to because stories connect us. They help us see that we share similar values. Stories help us to build trust amongst one another and helps us to create communities. And we need to be using the language of our audiences. Again, intentionality, planning, and relevance, all from a footing of being authentic. One of the beautiful things about storytelling is that we have in us the power to explain what it is that we're seeing. We have the powerful ability, particularly in a radio or an audio medium where people are not going to see this picture in front of them like you and I are looking at right now. You see, when it comes down to Biltong, because at the end of the day, this is really the metaphor, the story on which I'm basing this conversation. And I'm sure that when you first heard I'm going to be talking about Biltong making, you thought, how do you draw those two things together? You see, Biltong remains the star of the story, the star of the show. When you cut the meat and it's been spiced to perfection and you get the vinegar in there, and if it's a tough cut of meat, you can add some bicarb, you let it marinate, you pat it dry, but you only pat it, you don't rub it because you don't want to rub the spices off. Then you hang it up in the right temperature and the right amount of ventilation, you get the most delicious biltong. It's not really that complicated. It's good science, and it works more times than it doesn't. So we need to start setting the scene well for our stories. If you look at this picture, it's got a lot going on. If you need to describe this, it's actually quite hard because you don't really know where to start. So if you're telling stories and you're not going to be using a scene setter like we've got here in front of us, we need to remember that we need to start selling feelings before we start selling something way more tangible. If I'm looking at this picture and I want to tell a story, it depends on what it's connected to, of course, and that depends on what it is that you do. But I would sell relaxation. You see, in an exercise kind of scenario of storytelling, we don't sell the diet and we don't sell the hours in the gym every day. That's an essential part of the process. We sell, gents, we get sold the six-pack abs. And ladies, if this is relevant, you get sold the bikini-ready, beach-ready body. That's kind of the way storytelling works. I'm not going to say, well, let me just remind you what you can't eat. Let me remind you how long you're going to have to be in the gym. Let me remind you of the sacrifices that you have to make. Those aren't the kind of things that sell easily. Those aren't the kind of stories people really want to hear. Now, this isn't about being dishonest. I'm just using that as an example. I'm selling you the six-pack abs that my exercise program is going to give you. I haven't even yet told you how many days a week you need to exercise, or the fact that you can't eat this or you can't eat that. Those aren't the kind of things that we want to hear. When I look at this picture, I'm thinking about de-stressing, disconnecting from the 9 to 5. If you're that way inclined, I might sell you the tan. I might speak to you about the fresh air. I might ask you, how does relaxing on a white sandy beach under a palm tree next to crystal clear water, how does that make you feel? Those are the questions that we need to ask, and those are the stories that we need to tell. I'm not going to tell you the story about how expensive the airfare is and how long the bus ride is and the fact that the bus's air conditioner is broken to get you to this point. So when it comes to setting the scene well, we need to tell the stories correctly. We always need to start well. We need to keep a good pace when we're telling a story. We need to follow a determined storyline. I'm quickly going to jump in here. If you think this feels very artificial or very fake, some of the best stories are going to require this kind of intentionality, because this is the kind of stuff that makes a movie or a TV program successful. It always follows a recipe. Remember appropriate emotions inside of your story. How do you want to connect? We need to make the stories relatable. We need to do them and tell them in a practical way. We need to put listeners inside the story. And when you tell a story, you have to tell it confidently. Tell a story confidently, you need to have understood the story, you need to have practiced, and we'll get to that as well. I know I'm racing through this, and usually these things need a lot more time. We only have an hour, and we want to take care of your questions. So I'm just going to keep moving swiftly through this. Set the scene well and sell the outcome in your story, and not just all of the details. When you tell a story, it's important to keep it short. I thought this actually made a really nice name for a band. What do you think? Brevity and the Punchline. It sounds like a jazzy band. I don't know. Brevity means keeping things nice and short, and the punchline, of course, is where we land the story. And we must make sure that we land the stories well. When it comes to biltong, you can't hang it out for too long, because it's just going to get dry and chewy. It's going to get a little bit gross. So we test it regularly by giving it a squeeze. If it's still too soft, it isn't dry enough. Let the biltong hang just a little bit longer on that hook in the right atmosphere for the right amount of time, and you'll get the outcome that you want, that kind of biltong that's Moorish, and you just can't get enough of it. When it comes to stories, we have to get to the point quickly. Sometimes we just don't have a lot of time. If we're on radio, we don't have ages to tell a story. We might have a minute or less. So we need to keep those stories short. We need to get to the point quickly, and we need to actually know what that point is. If you haven't spent time understanding the punchline, you're just going to tell a story because you like telling stories. And when you get to the end of it, you wonder, what point have I actually made? Do you think they actually understood the lesson? Did those that have heard me tell the story know what I was trying to say? So the only way we really nail it, particularly when it comes to radio and audio, we need to plan it. We need to write it down. We need to ponder about it. We need to end the story. Does it need to be funny? Maybe. Does it need to be inspiring? Maybe. Is there a lesson to be learned? Maybe. Only you know what the outcome of your story is and what you want to leave with people. But you need to make sure that you get to that point quickly, and that you tell the story well and land that punchline. Because if there's a lesson that needs to be learned, they might have missed the lesson. If you're hoping that they would laugh and they don't, you've missed the opportunity. People might remember your story for all the wrong reasons. The day you crashed and burned, and not the day you told a great story that stuck with people. Before I move on, I want to tell you. Sorry, I had a bit of a mic issue there. I'm back. I hope you can hear me. Before we get on to the next point, and then start moving closer to hearing what you guys have to say and dealing with your questions, we'll talk now about collecting stories. And I love writing stuff down. I love collecting these stories, and then I love telling them. And sometimes I don't tell them well, but I tell them, and then I sit back and say, what didn't work about telling that story? Was it the way I started? Did I not really help them to understand the characters? Did they not kind of get the situation the characters were in? Did I not land that ending very well? And I have a story like that I've messed up many a time. So I'll tell you the story now, and we'll see how it goes. I have a family member who wanted to buy a new car. He had just the right amount of money in his vehicle allowance from work that was going to get him the car that he'd been eyeing for a very, very long time. Now, this is an older story, so it's an older car. It's the EOS from VW. He always wanted a convertible, and he got every magazine that he could. So he would go to the till point at the supermarket, and he would grab every car magazine he could, and he'd sit at home and you'd open them up. And these were the days before the internet had as much coverage on motoring as it does right now, trying to find every bit of information, every bit on this car, what's good about it, what isn't good about it. And he was paging, and he was comparing, and he was making his notes until he realized actually this was the car that he wanted to have. And then he decided it was time for a test drive. But that excitement that was raising up inside of him as he was getting ready for that test drive that next day, he could hardly sleep. He was visualizing what it would be like walking into the dealership, what it would be like sitting in the car, what it might be like taking that first test drive. Would it be everything that he hoped it would be? And anyway, he eventually fell asleep. He woke up the next day extra early, so excited. He lived out in Joburg, so he headed down to Four Ways to the VW garage. And as he pulled up there, you could feel his heart pounding here in his throat because he's thinking, this is a dream that started to come true. And he couldn't believe it was happening. And this day had finally arrived. And he walked in, and it was a Saturday morning, so there was a bit of a vibe. There was some boerewors rolls that they were making out there, and that smell kind of hit him as he was walking in. And then he saw all the cars, and he knew he wasn't going to be here where the polos are in the beginning. He walked in, and he walked between the polos. He got to the Golfs. He walked right past the Golfs. He had the Buckies on the left, and he looked to the back where the neon lighting was really bright and directed to where there was this EOS, which at that stage was like a real flagship for VW, standing there in all its glory, these neon lights reflecting off that polished paintwork, and it could not have looked better to him. And the nervousness that he felt, he said, I can't believe this is happening to me. And I'd walk through all those cars that everybody else was looking at, and here I am at the back. This is the business end. This is where it really goes down. The salesman came over and introduced himself. And he said, I'd love to have a look at this EOS. The salesman said, of course, let's have a look. Walked up to it, opened that door, and he could smell that new car smell that came falling out of the door, tumbling and hitting him, and he sniffed it in, and he thought, this is really happening. Got inside the car. The salesman said, here's the key. Would you like to start her up? Of course he wanted to start her up. But the key, he turned the key and absolutely nothing happened. The car was dead. So he said, well, can I at least open the roof? Can I see how the convertible roof works? Press the button. Nothing. The car was dead. The salesman was starting to panic. He's like, oh, I see what's happened. The batteries run dry. It's from us opening this top of this convertible, opening and closing, and we took for a test drive the other day, but it's been standing here for a while. No one's come and driven the car. I'm so terribly sorry. And my friend just kind of got out, and that feeling, that disappointment, like your heart is at your feet, and walked out of the dealership, and they were full of excuses, and he was devastated. Got into his car and drove off to where he knew there was another VW dealership, walked in there, got a test drive, bought the car, but it was just never the same. Now, I tell the story, maybe you've experienced something similar. Maybe you wish that you had the opportunity to buy a new car. Maybe you were with me when it comes to the way that it all made him feel, and you felt those same things, maybe not buying a car, but buying something else, that way that you feel so overwhelmed. But that disappointment that he felt is something that we all understand. In the corporate environment, I tell the story around wasting opportunities. Tell the story around the idea of losing money, but also tell it around failing forward. You've made that mistake. How do you pick things up from here? How do you make it better? How do you save the situation? Now, that story has come with me for a very long time, a very long way. It's a very old car, so the story's been around a while. But it's one of those stories, and it's a little bit too long to maybe share in your radio program, but it certainly has its place. It creates context. It creates opportunities that we feel. The idea of research, the idea of feeling proud about an accomplishment, about money we've saved, about how things can feel vibey on a Saturday morning. It puts us into this situation in various different aspects. And these are stories that we've heard, told. It wasn't me, it wasn't my car, it was someone who told me the story, and it stuck with me. He told it because he wanted to share how annoyed he was and how disappointed he was. I didn't put myself in that story. I kept it authentic, and I told his story. The punchline, good. Short, well, it depends on the medium. When it comes down to our stories, we need to practice, and we need to practice well. If you're making biltong, can you get biltong making wrong? Of course you can mess it up. Too much salt, yuck. Too much pepper, also not good. Soak it in vinegar for too long, trust me, the meat will taste terrible. Not enough ventilation when you've hung it up, mold city, people, mold city. So when you tell stories, can you get it wrong? Totally. Where do I even start? If I tell you how many stories I've told badly, Maybe there's been no real scene setting. Maybe there's been no start. Maybe the story was way too long for the medium. Maybe I landed it poorly. Maybe it was the wrong vibe for the audience. I don't know. Maybe it wasn't authentic. Maybe the story wasn't relatable. So if I'm getting things wrong, it's up to me to practice to get it right. When I practice, it gives me time to work on my technique. It helps me to replace the words I might otherwise have used with better words. It helps me to give the story rhythm. Practicing helps me to give my storytelling structure, and also helps me to say, that scene set that I created there, I don't think that evokes enough emotion. We need to get it right. Will we tell it wrong? That's okay. We'll fail forward. It's okay, dude, that you didn't sell that car. You messed it up, but now you know. We've got to make sure the battery stays charged. Now you know how not to fail at selling a car. We have to learn from our mistakes. And then we need to keep that storybook. When it comes to making good biltong, you write down the recipe that works, the one that brings you the best results, the one that gets people the most excited, tips other people share with you, other ideas that you try that helps the end product to work better. We need to be open. And so we need to be keeping a list of all of these stories, working on them, rounding the edges, dotting the I's, crossing the T's. When it comes to storytelling, it's about our observations. It's about metaphors. I had someone tell a story today on air. They were talking about the fact that they were at NAMPO, the agricultural show, and they were looking at cherry pickers for the farm. Now, the cherry pickers, I understand it, is kind of like a mini crane. Now, I don't know exactly how it works, but it lifts you up quite high to be able to reach the fruit at the top of the tree. I suppose you could use a ladder, but why if you can have a cherry picker like this? And as he was explaining it, he said they had to harness you in for your safety. They even put a little helmet on you, and then they hoist you up and give you that feeling of what the fruit pickers will experience when they pick the fruit. And suddenly when he was up there, he looked around and he said, you know what, when you arrive at NAMPO, it's South Africa's biggest, one of South Africa's biggest agricultural shows. You are overwhelmed by everything that is there. There's just so much. You wonder if you'll be able to see everything in one day. Suddenly he was 10 meters high in a cherry picker. And he said, everything suddenly seemed small. The voices of the people were slightly quieter. He had a bird's eye view. And it made him think a little bit about how God might see the world. Now, I'm going to leave that at that. I'm not going to get into that story anymore. He just had an experience, and suddenly it made him think about something. Where are you? What have you seen? What's inspired you from something that you've spotted? I was driving home from the radio station the other day. I saw a taxi in front of me with this bumper sticker. The bumper sticker said, I apologize for what I'm about to do. I thought, what can be better than seeing that on the back of a taxi? Because I only have to say taxi in the South African context, and you're potentially already rolling your eyes because you've got 3 stories to tell from your experience heading to work or school or wherever it was that you had to go this morning. I apologize for what I'm about to do. I grabbed this metaphor and I wrote a devotional on it. We all kind of expect taxi drivers, or some of them, to act in a particular way. Maybe when we look at our own lives as sinful human beings, we kind of want to say at the start of every day, to everybody, I apologize for what I'm about to do. Whether we mean to or not, we're going to slip up, we're going to mess up, and we are in need of God's grace. One bumper sticker, an entire devotional. These metaphors are things that we can hang stories on. Your pastor might be doing exactly the same at a Sunday sermon. The story that he launches into sets the tone with metaphors for what exactly it is that he's going to be preaching about. So when it comes to keeping that storybook, what do you see around you? What are some of the metaphors that you think about? I saw a man carrying a child on his shoulders, walking on the side of the road. They were just making their way on a long walk, and the little's legs just couldn't keep her up anymore, so she sat on dad's shoulders. No big deal, just a transportation that saves walking. Suddenly a metaphor for any kind of storytelling. In the Christian perspective, it's almost easy. I don't even have to explain what you're thinking about when it comes to where can you take this metaphor. We have to look at life experiences. We can listen to the stories of others. If you do share their stories, credit them if you know who shared it. When you're watching TV, what do you see? When you're online, when you're checking out your favorite memes, when you're watching reels, Let what others deem as mindless entertainment be your ammunition for keeping a book, a record of incredibly great stories. Have a book next to your bed. I have one with me all the time. I have one next to my bed. If I think of ideas, I'm writing them down. I've created a WhatsApp group for myself. I included my wife just so I could create the group, and then I dumped her off the group. She did it to me first. That's why I know how clever it was. And I have this WhatsApp group. I use it for anything. See something, go for a walk. That's my time of when I really think. Sometimes I just go for a long walk, and that's when my mind thinks and I come up with some of my best ideas. I just record them as a voice note in that group, or I write a note. There are plenty apps available for voice note recording and for you to make notes. When you search for statistics, jot them down. Those are often a good way to launch into a story. Read a good quote from your favorite author or your favorite speaker. Like I have one I've already shared with you. Write them down. One of my favorite public speakers is a South African, and he shared that statement that said, storytelling beats the spittle out of facts and figures. Whenever he shares a quote, I listen, and if there's an opportunity to use it, thanks to Douglas Kruger, then maybe you're also a fan of Douglas Kruger. He's a really cool South African guy, lives on Jersey Island, used to live in Joburg, and he's one of the best South African corporate storytellers I've ever heard in my life. If you're interested in following a good old South African who tells great stories, you can't go wrong with Douglas Kruger. I'm almost done. My hour is amper verby. This is a massive one for me. When you tell a story and when you do what you do well, when you create content, it needs to be memorable. You know, you could make a batch of Biltong, and maybe it's not even about making it if you're buying it. I'm just sticking with my metaphor of Biltong here. Someone could say, oh my goodness, this is the best I've ever tasted. This Biltong that he made is absolutely incredible. I'll drive all the way across the whole Cape Peninsula to where he sells his Biltong because it's worthwhile making that trip. It's the best I've ever had. So in order for us to tell great stories, we have to be prepared to work hard at it. If we're going to be curators of really great content, we have to be intentionally excellent, and we have to be intentional about being intentional. Because if you want to be a master storyteller, I read this quote, and I don't know who said it, so I can't credit the person, but I read this quote recently that says, being a master... Shall I try that again? I'm rushing, sorry. Being a master storyteller is one of the most important leadership skills. So build your repertoire, work on your skill set, become a true master storyteller, draw people in with your stories, thrill them. And as I mentioned earlier, give them that sell the six-pack abs and not the diet kind of experience. Give people a reason to tune in, to log on, to watch, to listen, or to read what you create. Be memorable. Let me run through these guys again for you just as we conclude the hour. If you want to tell stories that stick, I believe these are the 10 things we have to work on. We have to know our vision, because without a vision, people perish. That's biblical. But if you don't know why you want to tell a story, if you don't know what it is that you're doing or why you're doing it, then what's the point of it all, and where you're going, and what is the point that you're trying to make? So know your vision, know your audience, be relatable. You'll never forget that toilet roll hanging there, right? Something that we can all relate to. Be relatable. Don't be boring. Don't make spelling errors on a slide you're sharing with people from all over the world. Don't be boring. Be authentic. Set the scene well. Brevity in the punchline. That means keep it short. Well, it does depend on the medium. Hit that punchline hard. Practice the stories. Keep that storybook. Keep records of your stories and make sure your stories are memorable. And again, being a master storyteller is a must-have leadership skill. I'll tell you one more story before we move on. I love radio. I've loved radio since I was about 14 years old. And I used to take my mother's hairbrush, and I used to stand in front of the mirror, and I used to pretend that I was Alex J, because he was the guy I listened to most back on Radio 5, as it was in those days. And that was what I used to do, pretend I was him. I would copy his voice. I would stand there and I would back announce songs. I'd forward announce songs. I would do weather forecasts. I loved those. And I would do whatever I could to try and get myself to sound exactly like a radio presenter. And then the dream inside of me was born that this is what I want to do with my life. I took this dream to my dad. He and I have sorted our relationship out since then. He looked at me and he said, "No, man, you got to get a real job." So I did, but I never let that dream of being a radio presenter die. While I was at university studying, I went to watch this movie with this girl that I quite fancied. We ended up going on a double date. She invited a friend and she brought her date along, and the four of us went to watch a movie, and we were sitting in a coffee shop. And Jonathan knows sort of where this story goes. So I was sitting at this coffee shop table, and the four of us were there, and we all started this conversation. What do you do? We were students, some of us. What are you studying? When I got to this guy, his name's Chad. And I said to Chad, "What do you do?" He says, "I manage a community radio station here in Bloemfontein on the university campus." And suddenly something inside of me came alive. Something that my whole life I'd been dreaming about, and I'd kind of been preparing myself for it every moment I could. When we moved to Bloemfontein from Cape Town for a short stint living in the Free State, I would create radio programs on my double tape deck, and I would put songs in there. I'd forward announce, back announce, and I would put in all my news of what I was getting up to in my life. And then I would take these tapes and I would mail them to a friend in Cape Town, and then he would get the other friends together and they would listen to my radio program, which is basically some cool music together with my news. So I'd been preparing for this moment like my whole life. And I said to Chad, probably through a bit of a quivering voice, "So do you ever need more presenters?" He goes, "No, we got a pretty good presenter number here, but we always need guys, for backup." So I said, "Well, can I come and do a voice test and maybe be one of these backups?" He goes, "Yeah, I guess everybody thinks they can be on radio." And we set up a time, and I arrived there, and they'd set up a mock studio. They'd given me a few things to read, including a weather forecast. And I'd been reading them into my mother's hairbrush for years. And he gave me this thing and he said, "All right, when you're ready, go for it." And I was done. I didn't falter. I didn't stress, because I'd been preparing for that moment. It felt like my whole life. I got a call back the next day to say, "Well, we really liked your voice. We'd like to know if you'd be keen to be one of our stand-in presenters." And I said, "Absolutely, yes." A week later, I got a call saying one of our guys for our late night show is taking a little bit of leave. Would you be keen to stand in? I did his show for 2 weeks. And a week after that, they offered me the breakfast show position. And I've been doing breakfast shows for the last 20 years, with a little break in between when I went to go and work overseas. Sometimes we need to just look at our own lives and the things we've already done and the places we've already been, the dreams we've already had, the failures we've already experienced, and let those be the launch pad for us to tell a story. Maybe you're related to that. Maybe you too are living a dream and you love how things worked out for you after listening how things worked out for me. And I can sit here 25 years later and say what a pleasure it is to get behind a microphone every single day. And I know maybe you feel the same. There can't be too many people like us in the world that get to do what they've always wanted to and get to live a dream. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you, Brad. Really enjoyed that presentation. Yes, hearing the applause, and thank you so much. Yeah, given us a lot to think about. I just wondered, when are the packets of Biltong going to be arriving?
Well, all you need to do, Jonathan, is send me your address. Imagine, I'm going to be making biltong for ages. Man,
Exactly.
Wouldn't that be nice right now to have a piece of biltong?
Exactly. Sure. So in terms of questions, ladies and gents, please feel free to pop them up on the chat. Initially, we had some good mornings, people just kind of joining in and so forth. And then a question which was, could we please let us know if a summary of the training will be made available to us? I can tell you that this training has been recorded, so that recording will be made available to you after this session has been done. And then a very on-point comment that's made here, and maybe you can talk into that a little bit, Brad. But just somebody just saying, I've noticed how the elderly can tell good stories because of the detail and pace they apply to their storytelling. Thank you for that comment, Zibuse.
Beautiful. Thank you, Zibuse. Yeah, I'm going to jump in there on that. I think it comes down to masses of experience And that's why I said we have to practice. I think it comes down when it comes to the elderly. They know how to tell a good story because they've seen so much. They understand it. Their wisdom adds a lot of immense value to their stories. And I also think, Jonathan, they're in no rush and they love just telling stories. So I think that's why they're just so intentional and they just get that pace so right. They're in no rush and they know, generally speaking, we're hanging on every word.
Fantastic. No, that's a very good point. I see there's a question from Impact Radio in the way of a raised hand. Adele, if you don't mind unmuting yourself.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Brad. I really, really enjoyed that. And I think storytelling is so critical for us to get to bring our listeners into the place where we're trying to unpack something that is real or relatable. And so I just love this topic. I just wanted to check with regards to radio. I think, is it a good idea when telling a story to hook your listener, or how long should you kind of draw out a story? I mean, is there a set time frame in which you should unpack a story? Should it be one link and then wrap it up in the next link? Because, radio, especially with us, for instance, I know talk radio is quite different, but for community radio that is mostly music as well, we only have a short period of time and then we have to play the music. So would you say the stories need to just be very short and punchy, or can we put it over a link or two to tell a story, to hook your listener, to create a pause somewhere? How is the best way to actually put a story on a like a community radio station that plays music in between?
Hi, Adele. Always a pleasure to see you. Thanks for the question. When it comes to storytelling in the FM context, let's talk Impact Radio. We're a music-driven station. It's hard to dictate it in minutes and seconds, but I think if you can do it in a minute or less, I think you'll be setting people up well. There's not massive spaces of time between songs, and to be sure that we stick to our clock. So things can be, particularly on drive time radio, I think keeping the stories short and powerful are ideal. I'm not a major fan of drawing a story over to a link or two. One of the reasons I say that is people often tune in and out. So when the people are tuning in, they catch the second half of the story, the punchline, but they don't always know the context. And then you might have to end up saying, no, we're back from the music break. And it's before the song I was telling a story about, and then you end up having to recap the whole story again. So I think it's quite a subjective answer, I feel, but I don't think cutting a story into two like that is necessarily very good. And then in the talk radio context, telling the story in one long piece, I think is best. So if you can get the whole story done and you can move on, I think would be best in that context. I don't think it's the best idea to cut it up into pieces unless it's that kind of a story where it literally continues into different sections. But I think a story that you're trying to make a point quickly and punchy, and particularly in the area of creating metaphors, I think the shorter you can do it, the better. If you can nail it in a minute or less, I think that would be a really catchy story. You don't want to lose people. I mean, like my story with the car at the car dealership, for example, that's not a great FM story. That's an okay training kind of corporate boardroom space kind of a story in terms of length. But keeping stories shorter, I think, are way more powerful and impactful, particularly in the FM radio context. And if you're in a medium where you can tell longer stories, do so. But I think wrap it up in as quick as you can. I think brevity and the punchline remains key.
Fantastic. Thanks, Brad. Maybe on that note, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask a question.
Sure.
In terms of, we've spoken now into the radio setting and a music-driven radio station like Impact Radio versus podcasts. And I mean, earlier today, I was listening to a 41-minute podcast on leadership, and you've got various podcasts of various lengths and so forth. But to keep your audience engaged, whether it's a 41-minute podcast or a 3-minute story that you're sharing on an FM station, there are certain skills that you need to have, right? And also to know, like, hey, we need to move along now to the next point or whatever.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. People often ask me in the podcast space, how long should my podcast be? You know, and somehow people can drag one onto an hour and keep you enthralled and entertained. Sometimes 20 minutes, I'm already lost and I'm wondering maybe I should find someone else to listen to. So I think in the context of that, Jonathan, we tell stories, we can tell multiple stories. I was listening to a podcast of somebody telling their journey from where they started off and what they wanted to study, where they ended up being one of the most high-paid YouTube vloggers out there. And he was sharing his journey, which immediately becomes attractive because you wonder, how on earth did you end up in this place, particularly since he's not that young. So how do you end up in that? And as he shared his story, he was putting it into sections. Like, this is the story that got me. And he was talking about the skills that he had learned in his studies. And this is the skills he had learned going boating with his father. And this is how his mindset changed based on the drill sergeant that he encountered when he was initially wanting to become a police officer. So he broke it up into shorter stories that all started well, got you enthralled, and ended well, and got you to understand what created this man. So I think in the context of longer form, like a podcast, if you can get those stories and land each one, they can then be 5 minutes long as they're good. But I think even shorter than that, multiple stories that lead you up to the point that you're trying to make, instead of one long story. Because man, oh man, Jonathan, you got to nail the detail, and you got to make it enthralling, and you got to make it funny at some points. If you want to tell one very long story, you've got to be like Spies and Plessis used to be back in the day, and make the people laugh all the way from start to finish. And even if the punchline isn't good, you're in there. So I think multiple stories told well, I think, work better potentially than one very long story.
Thank you. Vanessa, I see you've got your hand up. Do you want to ask a question?
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Brad. That was an excellent presentation. Yes, I just have a quick question. So I report on community issues. I have a show called Keeping It Real, which speaks about real issues coming from the community. I just want to find out, how effective do you think that a story from the community that would leave room open for conversation after a story? Because for my show especially, I speak about real issues, and often I piggyback on stories from the community, and that leaves an open platform for conversation post that story. So how effective do you think that would be in your experience? I just want to ask from your experience.
Hi, Vanessa. Thank you so much. Good to meet you, and thank you for the question. There are few inserts that are better when it comes to communities than storytelling. You've got the uncle and the auntie that have been living there for 60 years. They were there before the roads were even tarred. They know the name of the school principal. They either were the mayor or they know the mayor. And they know the name of all the naughty kids. They know the name potentially of the gangsters. And they also know, and everybody would know them and call them Auntie so-and-so by name. These are figures in the community that we latch onto because we mostly know them. We know the issues we have in our various communities. We know the successes we have in our communities. We know the churches in the communities. They know each other. We know the schools, and maybe my child and your child go to the same school, a connection point. So there's nothing better in the particularly community radio setting than telling those community stories, because those are those connection points. Yes, I also was without electricity for X number of days. I too had to experience when the dirt truck didn't come and collect it and what the sidewalks looked like. We all lived in it together. And I think it opens up things. One more thing to mention, if you want to comment on what I've said, Vanessa, but now I've forgotten the point that I was going to make. Hang on, it's coming to me. Oh yes, when things go really well in the community, it draws people together. When it goes really badly, it draws people together. So we never waste a good, difficult opportunity. And when we tell those stories, we start to say, you know what I'm talking about, Vanessa, because you were there. And if your neighbor, who is not very neighborly, happens to listen to the story, then they feel like they've missed out. Oh, I'm not involved in the community. I didn't go to the street braai. I'm not involved at my local church or whatever. these also create opportunities to draw people in, even if initially they were negative or chose to not be involved. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but when it comes to real issues, community is essential, and then giving enough time, I would think, and to leave space for opportunities for messaging, and however that would work on your platform, to give people a space to talk and to share, but from different, this person maybe a bit more well off, this one not, this one is older, this one is younger. Try and create how can I say, an array of stories coming in, so it isn't all one-sided.
Thank you. You've answered me very well. Definitely. I'd like to comment by saying that there's no such thing as bad media. Yeah. Definitely. And there's no such thing as a bad conversation, because I even found out in my experience, even controversy brings people together. Everybody wants to make a comment and wants to contribute in some way, whether it's a good conversation or whether it's a controversial conversation. Everybody wants to be a part of it. So it brings people together. So I totally agree with you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for your question, Vanessa.
Any other questions? Anybody else want to maybe just put up their hand and say, hey, I've got a question or a comment? Oh, there we go.
Yeah, this is Khanya. Hi, Jonathan. Hi, everybody.
Morning.
For me, it's, what I want to ask Brad is, with now the advent of TikTok and all the other media, and, some people saying radio is dying and so on, how can we leverage more on these platforms without really losing the identity and the value and the values that we stand for as various radio stations?
Hi, thanks. I missed the name there, Jonathan. Did you catch the gentleman's name?
No, sadly not.
My name is Khanya, Brad.
Sorry, can you repeat it? I didn't hear.
Khanya is my name.
Khanya. Hi, Khanya. Thanks so much for your question. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff out there, and we need to stay relevant. I just want to say, I was reading some statistics last week, Khanya, and they were saying 80% of people around the African continent still get all their daily news from radio, and 60 to 70% of African population choose radio over every other medium to gain their information and their entertainment. When we see podcasts and we see what's happening online and YouTube and the like, we immediately think, here's our massive competition. What's the point of me even trying? There's no way I can compete with them. There are many people that are enjoying all that online content, but in the African, and South Africa falls into that category as well, although it's far more blessed in the area of moving and enjoying the online space. But I mean, it's no different to Kenya, Tanzania, Nigeria, these areas where the online presence is massive, and other countries in Africa as well. But if you think that 80% of people want their news stories from you, if you're involved in radio, and I can see you are, and 60 to 70% of people in this continent want their entertainment, their music, and their stories to come from you, we're not really competing with them. It feels like we have the upper hand. So keep on doing what you do, but just make sure that you stay on top of things. In other words, what I create on radio, I can also share in the online space, because radio is once and done. But if I can save that and create a podcast, I have a show which can then be repeated for people who couldn't listen, and it becomes a podcasting opportunity, radio on demand. So we don't waste those radio opportunities. We connect with what the online space is offering people, and we join in there. But we are still relevant. I think in the African context, radio is going to be relevant way longer than we imagine. There's always still a space, of course, for the online media, and that's growing. But clearly, the latest statistics and the stories I'm getting out of the African continent are telling us that we are relevant. We just need to keep building on our stories and make sure our stories are in line with what's happening today. We can't be stuck in the 90s. We need to be in the 2024s, even with our storytelling and our skill set. And that comes from good leadership and the ability to stretch and make our presenters better, and for us to not rest on our laurels and do things like we've always done them. We need to also be prepared to grow.
Yeah. So
thank you very much. And just a follow-up, Jonathan, quickly. Your thoughts then, Brad, on personality-driven radio versus content-driven radio?
Yeah, that's a training program for a whole day there, Khanya. But I'm going to say this: we need to have people with the kind of personalities that are going to tell the story well. If you've got somebody there that's only there because they want to try and grow their Instagram numbers or try and sell their latest album, and they're going to kind of be more obsessed with themselves than on the vision of the station, then I don't think you've got a good match. But if you've got a vibrant personality, and we all have them in our radio stations, a vibrant personality who's also prepared to do the hard work, is prepared to understand what the vision of the station is and what the various listeners' needs are, and developing content to meet those needs, and doing it with a vibrant, beautiful personality, those are that's the sweet spot that you're really looking for. So I think there's a place for both. Content is king. You've heard it 1,000 times. I'm going to say it again. Content is king. The way you carry that content across, I think, is what's really, really important. And don't be afraid, Khanya, if you have to rap a presenter over the knuckles to say, come now, remember why you're here, then go, by all means do that.
Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thanks, Khanya. Good questions there. And thanks, Brad. If I could just add, something that I heard a number of years ago was that thing, yes, content is king. And in that context is queen. So to get the right context, and it's the whole thing of the art of storytelling that you've been speaking to us about, Brad. So thanks for that. Brilliant, brilliant. I see GNCR has got a hand up. Curious to hear the question from GNCR. Good audience there.
My question, I'm not sure if others in the house have got a question, but just this one from me. How do you, so daily on radio, how do you keep your creativity? Are there any tricks that a presenter needs to have to keep themselves on the cutting edge of creativity and fresh ideas, input? What do you do to help yourself to be that creative content producer that makes good radio?
Thanks so much. I didn't catch a name there except the me part. So if you don't mind just mentioning your name, I'd love to speak to you by name.
Michelle, sorry.
Michelle, lovely to meet you, Michelle. Thank you for your question. Having fresh ideas is absolutely essential, and therefore you have to be challenged to soak up information from everywhere. Now, you often hear presenters tell you a story, and you can realize they've got News 24's main page open, and they're now presenting an entire program. But I don't want to hear what's on News 24, because I might, if that's my news source, I can open it on my computer and see that for myself. So don't just read what I can already see, just as an example, Michelle. So in order for us to stay relevant, we need to be thinking people, and we need to be walking around, like I said, making our notes, watching what's happening on TV, wondering how what's happening makes people feel, looking at real life stuff around us. What am I seeing in front of me? What am I struggling with in my faith? What happened in my parenting? What happened with my next door neighbor? What happened? Not to draw them and their personal stories into the agenda, but I'm always kind of awake to what's happening around me, continuously making notes. I mentioned earlier on about note keeping for storytelling. I do exactly the same for the ideas that I have, and I know many other presenters do that as well. What is it that I'm going to be talking about that's fresh, that's relevant? Sometimes you see a news article, it's less about the content of that news article, because it'll be covered somewhere in your program or on the news or in the news channel. But what's happening, let me, if I may, Michelle, just use one example. If we think about the tragedy in George with the building that collapsed there, for example, many lives were lost. It should never have happened, but there are so many ideas that come out of there. What is the church doing, if we want to bring it to a Christian context? What is the church doing to support families? What is the church doing to support rescue workers? What are we doing? A friend of mine, Mike Bernard, you might know him very well. Mike Bernard said to me when we had a conversation around this, he said, why are people so concerned for the life of the person under the rubble? Did we have the same concern for his life when he was out of the rubble? Now, that was a massive thought process for me. Now, yes, absolutely, he needs to be cared for, and they need to find his family, and they need to identify him. Please don't misunderstand me, but are we caring for people all the time, or are we only caring for people if they are in an emergency or a life and death situation? These are moments to get us to think. So we have to be active thinkers about what's happening in the world around us, in the media, in sport, when we sit down and have a meal, when we're interacting with our friends. Like, what are the things that pop up that are real life things? Storytelling is always about being relatable, Michelle. So if I see or hear something in my space, if I have a bit of a wobble in my faith, it's very possible that somebody else feels the same way, but they might be too embarrassed to own up. So I'm going to say it. And I might encourage you. I might fill you with hope at the same time. And that's in a Christian context. But I think you hear where I'm going. It can fit in everywhere else. We have to stop being lazy. I really think we have to stop just going into studios and hope for the best with a devotional book under our arm and hope that it's going to be enough. We have to be intentionally excellent. And that takes hard work, dedication, and intentionality. I'm repeating a lot of the words I said earlier on, but that I think is what it takes to create the kind of radio where people sit in their cars and they just have to hear how the conversation ends. They can't even get out. They'll be late for work, but they have to hear how it ends. And for that to be excellent depends on us.
So good. Thank you so much, Brad. Fantastic. Then a question from Danny saying, are there any ideas that other community radio stations have done that could work in South Africa?
I'm not sure I understand the question 100%, Jonathan. I just want to find it. See if I see it here in front of me. It might help me a little bit.
Okay.
I've got it here in front of me.
You got it. Great.
I'm not sure 100%, Danny, if you can help me to understand the question, but I think there needs to be conversations between radio stations. I think there's a lot of us and them, particularly even in the Christian context, because we're all really trying to achieve the same thing in our different stations in our own way through different media. So I think that's why the ACM conferences, as an example, are excellent places for us to throw ideas around and to see what works for you and what doesn't. At the end of the day, we're all heading in the same direction. We're not competing against one another. Community radio stations, I think, also like to hold on to, this is my stuff. But we're working in different communities generally. We have different listeners because we might play different styles of music. Some might be music-driven, others might be talk-driven. But I think we need to create platforms for communication and we need to share our stories. So, Danny, I don't know if I've answered it correctly, but I think having open conversations is what's necessary for us to move forward, particularly in the community radio space. And not be afraid to ask. We rely on money. What is it that's worked for you in the fundraising space? This is what's worked well for us, etc. I hope I've helped you there, Danny.
That's fantastic. Yeah. And I would encourage everyone that's part of this training session to make a plan to get to this year's conference. It's in Durban at an amazing location along the Gold Coast, so to speak. And it's a great opportunity because there you'll meet people face to face and you can exchange numbers and you can talk and have those brilliant conversations that we need to have. It really is on point. Thanks, Brad, for that. Yeah. And also please remember, ACM, we do online trainings like this. So there are, upcoming ones and there've been past ones, and you can just connect with Natalie, for example, on the fundraising thing. And you can just get information about that as well. All right. Well, we're nearing the landing time, and I don't see any other questions, but I do appreciate that Brad's just popped up his contact details.
Please.
Yeah, go for it, Brad.
Jonathan, just want to say, if anybody wants to get in touch, I'm really open to chat. Again, I'm not the sage on the stage. I'm the guide on the side. So I'm always willing to listen if anyone's got ideas. I want to grow, and if anybody else wants to know something, I'm happy to jump in and answer with what I know. So let's support one another. That's really what it's all about.
Yeah, that's so on point. So on point. Let's support one another. Cool. GNCR, you've still got your hand up. I don't know if that's from earlier or if you just want to ask one last question before we wrap up.
Sorry, Michelle here again. Sorry, just with a thought to pass on to Danny is I was touched by this one car guard who noticed that I had GNCR sticker on my car, and he said, do you work for that place or you're a fan of it? So I said, no, I work there. So he said, there's a story on your radio. I'm a young guy. He says, our lives go up and our lives go down. But he says there's a story where they tell other people's stories, and I listen to those, whether I'm up or whether I'm down. because I see it all works out for them good in the end. So I just think the whole wonderful lesson we're learning today of telling stories, people's stories, you know, the good, the bad, the ugly, but how God came through. That encouraged this young fella, and Romans 8:28 in South Africa, we need it. We got the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Yeah.
Thanks, Michelle.
Thanks. Fantastic. Great. Well, ladies and gents, I think we're pretty much done. We've had a wonderful time, a lot to take in. Thank you, Brad. Really, really appreciate it. Many people just saying thank you so much, Brad, in the comment section. And I'm now going to hand over to Natalie, our General Manager at the Association of Christian Media. Natalie, over to you.
Thank you so much to Brad, and thank you to Jonathan as well for emceeing and for emceeing most of our training at the moment, which is really great. We appreciate it a lot, Jonathan.
Great pleasure.
So our next training session is coming up at CCFM. It will be in person this time. It will be led by Yapi Swanepoel on the 5th of June, 2024. And the topic is going to be Make Social Media Work for You in 2024. It's a whole day intensive training session on social media. So I would really encourage you to attend if you are in Cape Town. And so thank you so much to everyone for being here today, for being part of the training. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.